started. So hi everyone, welcome to the final presentation in the 2020 Environmental Arts and Humanities Network webinar series. I'm Hayley Singer, the convener of the network, and I'm zooming into you from Bunurong country, the land of the two bays, where I live as an uninvited settler on unceded lands. And I'm grateful and I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners and knowledge bearers of this place. This webinar series invites scholars, artists and storytellers to reflect on ways that environmental arts and humanities can provoke deep engagement with and robust community discussion about the multiple and overlapping environmental and cultural crises of our times. The Enviro Arts Network and this event is supported by the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, and I'm really grateful to have that support because these conversations, I think, are urgent and vital. So today's webinar is on the topic of reading Australian Cli-Fi in secondary schools, and it's to be presented by Dr. Larissa McLean Davies and Dr. Sarah E. Truman, who will consider the ways in which thinking with issues of sustainability and climate crisis prompt new imaginings of reading and teacher education in an Australian settler-colonial context. And I'm excited too that Dr. Joelle Gurgis, climate scientist and writer, will offer a response to the presentation. A few introductions, and then I'll talk through the process of today, and then we'll get into the presentation. So Larissa McLean Davies is Associate Professor in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne and Literary Education Lab. Larissa is a leading Australian academic in literary education, with her research and publications spanning the fields of literary studies and English education. Hi, Larissa, it's great to have you here. Sarah E. Truman researches English literary education, speculative fiction and pedagogies of reading and writing at the University of Melbourne's Literary Education Lab. Sarah's ongoing and research creation practices include Walking Lab, which I absolutely love, and Oblique Curiosities. Hi, Sarah, nice to have you here. And Joelle Gurgis is an award-winning climate scientist and writer from the Australian National University. She's an internationally recognised expert in Australian and Southern Hemisphere climate variability and change, based in the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes. Her research focuses on providing a long-term historical context for assessing recently observed climate variability and extremes. Hi, Joelle, it's really great to have you here as well. So for our audience members, we'll have Q&As managed both through the chat box and the Q&A function. Please, anytime throughout the presentation, load your copious amounts of questions and we will try to get through them all at the end. But the way this webinar will go today is that Larissa and Sarah will provide a presentation, then Joelle will provide a response, there'll be a discussion, and then we'll attend to any audience questions. So that's all from me for the moment. I'm going to hand over to Larissa and Sarah now.
Thanks very much, Hayley. Thanks for that welcome. We're just going to start sharing our slides, I think. Sarah? Terrific. Fantastic. Hi, everybody. I'm Larissa McLean Davies, and with Sarah Truman, we're delighted to be here. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the lands on which we are independently meeting with you today. We're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. We acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge that they've been on these lands for thousands of years and the land has never been ceded. We have some images there on our own experience in the day-to-day of these lands. Mine in the far east of Melbourne, Sarah's in a much more urban kind of environment. We share this because we acknowledge the stories, the lines, the song lines, and the range of narratives that are parts of these lands, and we acknowledge the privilege it is to be talking about story, to be talking about the importance of story in cultures today with you. And the privilege it is to be able to have that opportunity. Thanks, Sarah. So, folks, we're here to talk to you about the secondary school curriculum on a Friday morning at the end of the year. Our work is really invested in thinking about futures, thinking about speculating on futures and enacting those futures with secondary school students and with teachers. We're really interested in the kinds of fictions, the kinds of stories that are going to make a difference to the way that young people feel and think in the world, the kinds of knowledges that teachers need to have, and the way that needs to change. We're really interested in subject English, which came to Australia as the main and most significant arm of colonisation, and how that subject, as it is still carrying that colonial inheritance, what that needs to look like in a 21st century pluralistic, diverse context. So they're the main things that are kind of driving our work. They're the main issues that we're facing, and so we're very interested in what kind of conditions we need to bring those changes about and what kind of questions we need to ask in order to raise those issues. So I'm going to start looking at some of those issues by leaping straight into a secondary classroom, a privilege that I often have, that Sarah and I often have, to be working alongside teachers. I'm going to read you a story about being. It's a story about a story. And we're going to start with that, about an experience of this amazing text very recently this year in a classroom. So I'm just going to read this story to you. And I want to acknowledge that this is this story is part of some work that Sarah and I have been undertaking with Indigenous scholar and academic Sandra Phillips at UQ. So this little story is part of that broader piece of work. Here we go. It's July 2020. And Wani author Alexis Wright is holding a workshop on her novel Carpentaria for secondary students at a Bayside Melbourne high school in Victoria, Australia. Carpentaria has been set for study for the final examination in the specialist Year 12 subject called literature. Although Carpentaria was published last decade and received Australia's highest accolade for fiction, the Miles Franklin Award, it's new to the secondary school list. And the student's teacher, because of this, has approached Alexis to give the class insights into this text and answer their questions, which is a very common practice for teachers and writers. The workshop was to be held at the university, where Alexis is Bouvier Chair in Australian Literature, but the COVID pandemic means that, just like us today, that she is zooming in from her home while the students and the teachers are at school. It was July. They're all socially distant. They're all wearing masks. They're all at individual computers, so you can imagine this workshop. Carpentaria is set in a fictional town called Desperance on the Gulf of Carpentaria in northern Queensland, Australia. It's a complex polyvocal text that explores the relations between settler colonialism, climate change, mining and Indigenous activism through interwoven stories of Indigenous and white characters. It's a story about a place where the climate is in constant change and where colonial past, present, futures attempt to invade an Indigenous spatio-temporal climate balance. Carpentaria offers glimpses of country as vibrant life, entwined with human and animal ontologies, rather than viewed from the settler perspective of Terra Nullius, inert and waiting for extraction. Alexis has written widely about Carpentaria and is generously sharing her decisions regarding all aspects of the novel with the predominantly white secondary English students. She tells them she set out to write a great work of Australian literature and to offer to a nation who says, but we know your story already, a narrative tour de force that they have not heard and has not been listened to. I wanted to sing this country more powerfully, she says, and talks about the land of Australia being covered by huge epochal stories and the need to enact a vision of Australian literature as self-governing. Despite their masks, their social distance from each other in the classroom, their conversation with Alexis being mediated by a laptop screen, the students remain really focused for an hour and a half. They have prepared specific questions about the text, mindful of the impending high-stakes exam that stops for nothing, not for climate crisis, not for cultural crisis as taken up by Carpentaria, and certainly not for the pandemic that they're sitting in right at this time. In answering their questions, though, Alexis constantly gestures towards more than the detail on the page, opening up a way of thinking and knowing relationally with and through text. In this way of reading, ontology and epistemology are intertwined. Country, story and knowing are not separated. The workshop, therefore, is much more than the archetype of an author sharing insights of her work with students prior to an exam. It is an invitation into a conversation where all times are important and unresolved, and where texts and their readers can imagine new possibilities and new worlds. Thanks, Sarah. So we wanted to start with this story because it really raises, in a moment, in a vignette, some of both the possibilities and the challenges of texts in schools. So on the one hand, and these are the kind of three themes that are going to be coming through this talk, the vignette raises the possibilities of new ways of thinking and reading, new possibilities for texts that haven't been included in the secondary classroom. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It raises the challenges for enacting change in classrooms in ways that I want to unpack a little bit more now. And it also suggests some ways that we might be able to address these challenges. And that will be another key thing. So those three things, those three threads, the possibilities, the current challenges, and the ways in which we want to meet those challenges are the things that we want to talk about with you today. So on the one hand, we can say that the vignette is really incredibly positive. We've got a text, we've got, despite all of the conditions, we've got a writer, an acclaimed Australian writer, Indigenous scholar in classrooms with students talking about her work. And this, of course, is a fantastic step forward for a subject where Indigenous writing hasn't been included for, in fact, up until really recent times in any kind of systematic way. I want to talk about the challenges of that and why this moment of Alexis talking about this text, why this text even being on the list is something remarkable, is something that is not something that's going to be common around schools in Australia. And so we just want to do a little bit of a backstory, I guess, to subject English and the conditions that we're facing when we want to actually introduce climate fiction, when we want to introduce new stories and new voices into this subject area. So our question is, well, and our little bit of backstory is whose stories have been told and heard. So first of all, we have here some of the challenges. We know historically that Australian fiction has been marginalised. So all Australian fiction has been marginalised in our secondary English curriculum. But I want to explain why that's the case. So in our previous slide, what you saw there was we'll just flick back to that for a moment. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That's all right. Sarah's doing the driving here. What we see there is a couple of moments here, and we know from the Black Lives Matter moment this year, the Black Lives Matter protest all around the world, that what we had was a real take-up of fiction alongside that. And what we saw from that, and this was not just in Australia, we had a whole range of fiction that was sold out, never before kind of seen the take-up of this fiction. And the reason that we would argue it's the case, because some of these stories and some of these voices hadn't been heard in schools, and these were things that were new for many members of the Australian public. And so we'll go on, Sarah, to the next one. To think about why that's the case, we need to have a little bit of an understanding of what's actually been happening in education around Australian fiction. So, as I said right at the start, the notion of studying English at both universities and schools in Australia has been very much linked into this notion of becoming part of the empire. And so therefore, teaching Australian literature, even the notion that an Australian literary voice or range of voices exists, has been something that has not had a presence in this country in any kind of routine way. The notion from A.A. Phillips in the 1960s of the cultural cringe is very strongly still present in schools and certainly in our history. So this slide just gives a couple of examples from the early part of the 20th century, just thinking about what was going on and what was the conditions around this. So we have a professor of English literature at the university that we're speaking from, at Melbourne University, talking about Australian literature. And he was talking about this, and he was regularly talking about this in The Age. And you can see there on your screen what was the view of Professor Cowling about Australian literature. So this is what he was on record saying, that the rewards of literature are not good enough to attract the best minds, that book production is on the average poor, good novels in Australia are bound to be few, and literary culture is not indigenous like the gum tree. So we have this kind of, a professor of literature at an esteemed university presenting Australian literature in a certain kind of way. Of course, it wasn't only at the University of Melbourne that these views were held. This is a very famous kind of story. Thanks, Sarah. We'll go to the next one, which is from Adelaide University. And the jury professor of literature, Professor Stewart, was asked to give the very first Commonwealth Literary Fund talk about Australian literature. So you can see at the bottom of the slide there, at this stage, there was already 2 volumes of Australian literature from the beginnings in operation. So Professor Stewart comes to this very important event at Adelaide University, funded by the Commonwealth Literary Fund, and says, sorry, we'll just go to that. We've just jumped there, Sarah. Yeah, thank you. That's great. Beautiful. And he starts by saying this: I'm most grateful to the Commonwealth Literary Fund for providing the funds to give these lectures in Australian literature, but unfortunately they've neglected to provide any literature. I will therefore lecture on the British writer's text, D.H. Lawrence's Kangaroo. So the kangaroo story, as we like to call it, gives us a really good example of what it is to be thinking about teaching Australian literature in this country. So we have this history, this really strong history of actually rejecting fiction in this country that has any kind of local voices and any kind of ways of thinking about what it is to be in this place. There are a whole kind of historical reasons around that, and I've just got there on the bottom of the screen. It wasn't until just reminding us, the late 1940s, that Australians became Australian citizens, that they weren't considered constitutionally to be British citizens. So we have this really long arm of the empire that has been reaching into education, reaching into a colonised settler consciousness for such a long time. And this, of course, has impacted on a subject like English, which the whole purpose was it would help those people in this country, all people in this country, to actually draw closer to the empire. Thanks, Sarah. We're going to keep going. So what we've found is that really the work what's become clear is that this kind of consciousness about Australian literature and what literature is valuable has in fact reached right into our current and most recent thinking about texts. So you can see there on the screen what English, we would argue, has been doing, although there's been a lot of efforts to change texts, a lot of conversation about resources, that English has largely been keeping the canon in place. So while Australian texts have been increasingly set for study since the 1970s, and education department panels and examination boards are working with this and are advocating for Australian texts, what we do know is that teachers still have discretion, and there are all kinds of what Bourdieu might say are hidden curriculum ways in which these kinds of imperial imperatives are being kept in place. So the work of Richard Teese has talked about the way high-stakes examination systems, which privilege students who write on Shakespeare, for instance, impact on the way in which secondary teachers will take up any kind of Australian fiction. I've talked previously about this idea of Magwitch madness, drawing from Charles Dickens' notion or idea of great expectations, and the idea of Australians hankering and really wanting to move back to the empire. We see that happening, particularly in Australian schools as well. So what this means is that Australian literature has not gained ground. Diverse Australian literatures have not gained ground in secondary classrooms. And we just want to give you a couple of examples of what that looks like for students. So moving on, thanks, Sarah. So I'm just going to give you 3 quick examples of, I guess what we're going to talk about here is showing you the problem. So there's a wonderful resource, a wonderful database that Tim Dolan and team from Curtin and a range of other contexts, supported by the ARC, looked at all of the curriculum around Australia from 1945 to 2005. And from that database, what we can see is the top 10 texts that have been set across that whole period of time, to 1945 to 2005. And what you can see there are a range of imperial texts. So we'll just give you a chance to look at that. You can see the publication date, and you can see, of course, where they have come from, which is North America and Britain. So this is what the diet that most students in Australia will have received over this time. We'll go on to our next slide. So that gives us a sense of, and this is, I should say, that they've harvested this data from Year 12 examinations. So these are the things that are considered to be most valuable. So for the last 4 years, I've been fortunate to be leading an ARC project on teachers' literary knowledge. And part of the project was a survey of teachers in 2017, 2018 about the text. This is a nationwide survey. We had about 750 respondents. And from that survey, we asked about the text that teachers were most teaching in classrooms. And this is the list that we got. So this is 2017, 2018. So you can begin to see, everybody, the challenges of actually introducing texts that might be speculating on different kinds of futures, looking at science fiction, taking up issues of climate. I've got some speculative work there, but it's 1985 by George Orwell, 1984. Yeah, so that's okay. Yeah, so just have a look there. So, and the interesting thing for that is, of course, the previous slide, which showed you the work that Dolan and team had done right from 1945 to 2005, is very similar in text to actually what you're seeing now. This is the, yeah, thanks, Sarah, terrific. We'll move on to our next one.
I think it's gone.
Is it not, it's not coming on?
No.
Oh, there you go. All right, so I guess the last thing to say is that we have done some other work where we've looked particularly at the kinds of Australian texts that have been taught. But what we have found is when Australian texts are taught, they're often young adult texts. And again, what we're not seeing is any kind of speculative work. Again, we're seeing texts that are largely from the past. So what we have is a vision of subject English in Australia that is keeping the canon in place, is making it difficult for teachers and schools and students to be addressing through fiction the kind of key questions around climate, around rethinking futures that we understand a subject like English would really be responsible for. And I'm now going to hand over to Sarah.
Okay. Oh, great. And I'm not muted, correct? Okay, just continue. English literary education is often framed through 4 models, including English for growth, English for skills, for cultural heritage, and cultural analysis. These models align with different purposes of subject English that have developed in the past 50 years. While debates about the role and purpose of literature in the curriculum have been part of English since it has been formally taught in schools. As early as the 1880s, colonial powers have discussed the importance of teaching literature as a civilizing or humanizing process in imperial settings such as British-occupied India and settler-colonial states like Canada and Australia. Peter Widdowson describes the original aims of the creation of the English canon as an ideologically driven initiative to humanize and civilize potentially disruptive elements in society. We highlight this thread in the history of English curriculum to demonstrate that reading and writing literature in schools and beyond has never been apolitical. English as a subject in part depends on conceptualizations of literature as a material force for cultural knowledge and personal growth and citizenry. And so we're asking in our project that I'm going to talk about how we might foreground other stories in English and specifically disrupt these kind of humanist logics. So in our research, we turn to feminist scholars and bring them to bear on literary education to further explore and politicize the promise of literature and narrative to materially shape readers and unsettle this Euro-Western humanizing discourse. Specifically, we've been thinking with Black literary scholar Sylvia Wynter in troubling humanism and humanizing processes in regard to stories. Sylvia Wynter has written extensively about the production of the human in Western society, wherein who counts as human is tethered to white Euro-Western ideals that align with the stories we prize and deem universal in the English canon, the kinds of literacies that are valued, and tied to Euro-Western aesthetics. You can see the Vitruvian man there. Winter's writing tracked the production of the human, or what she calls man with a capital M, through colonial capitalism entwined with transatlantic slavery and back to the origins of the discipline of the humanities. Importantly, Winter acknowledges that the production of a particular kind of human who stands in for and represents all humanity, or what counts as the civilized subject, has occurred through the stories that are foregrounded in society. Winter puts forth the notion of what she calls homo narrans, or the narrative human, to explain in her view how the human brain developed biologically in conjunction with language and storytelling. For Winter, this means that as a species and as individuals, we're not only shaped by biology, but also through our storytelling activities. The stories we tell ourselves have material effects on who we will become and have the potential to create different worlds in different, what she calls, genres of being human. Winter's arguments resonate with English literary studies accounts of the material effects of stories on shaping who we become, but also asks us to consider whose stories are prioritized, whose stories are listened to, whose stories are accounted for in literary education. In our research, we think alongside Winter and feminist materialist scholars to consider the materiality of stories or narratives in the creation of worlds, and the ethics and politics of being accountable to, as Donna Haraway says, stories that matter. Throughout her career, STS scholar Haraway has addressed the material effects not only of the content of stories, but how they are told and who's telling them. From a feminist materialist perspective, the theorists, rhetorical styles, and techniques we use to analyze stories also matter and have material effects. Similarly, Karen Barad asks us to consider not only what stories matter, but what gets left out of mattering. This mode of attending to what is absent as well as what is present in curricula and in educational research is a kind of speculative practice because we're not always taught to look for what's missing. In two decades into the 21st century, it remains a challenge to include diverse voices and stories in the secondary English curriculum in Australia. This has been pointed out by numerous scholars from numerous angles. And in order to stop, as Larissa says, admiring the problem, we've started a collaboration with the Stella Prize as a way of unsettling English literary education in schools. And I'm going to talk through the project broadly and then focus how the theme of climate fiction has emerged as an important area in our research and current work with Alexis Wright and Sandra Phillips around how to bring specifically Indigenous climate fictions into schools. So the project's called the Teacher Researchers Project, and it functions by buying teachers out of school for 5 days to conduct their own literary research project based on a contemporary text written by an Australian woman or non-binary author that's long-listed in the Stella Prize. The teacher's task is to embed a text that they choose in cultural resources such as archival materials or whatever they find useful for building a curricula around that would make sense in their situated school context. For example, one teacher brought Maxine Clark's The Hate Race in and contextualized it using archival resources around the White Australia policy. Another taught Ellen Van Irvin's Heat and Light and prioritized their readings around Indigenous knowledges and lands. The intertextual knowledge-making enhanced literary learning in their classrooms and positioned the teachers as researchers into the depth and diversity of what should count as literature in contemporary classrooms. It prioritized teachers' situated interests as important pedagogical tools in curricular development. So in many ways, it's trying to move away from the grand narratives, which is challenging in a subject that is often foregrounded on Euro-Western humanist universalisms. Our research has shown that simply recommending texts for teachers to teach is not enough. They need time to develop relationship with texts in order to bring them into classrooms in meaningful ways. And evidence from the project suggests that teachers are eager to teach texts with diverse worldviews, but often do not feel equipped to engage with new literatures, particularly with the themes of Indigenous sovereignty, race, and climate change. Also, the project has raised discussions on how teachers need training in how to frame literary texts in ways that are respectful of Indigenous worldviews and texts that discuss race. Currently in Australia, as Larissa showed earlier, one of the go-to texts to teach about racism is still To Kill a Mockingbird, as if racism happens far away somewhere in the past and it's not ongoing. In addition, teachers have noted there's frequent pushback from parents and, to our dismay, other teachers around changing texts, couched in a belief that students perform better on tests with canonical texts, as well as arguments about the literariness of certain texts. In terms of teaching texts discussing climate change and climate racism, there's also concerns around climate change denialism and science denialism among students and other teachers and even the government. How do English teachers address this issue is part of our concern. So our current iteration that we're working on of this project is the Cli-Fi iteration. So I'll just talk a bit about our thinking around this. So in The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, Amitav Ghosh argues that when climate change is addressed in books, it is normally through non-fiction writing rather than literature. Ghosh ponders whether the mention of climate relegates a novel to genre fiction, such as science fiction, as if considering climate change is somehow akin to extraterrestrials or interplanetary travel. Ghosh is correct in asserting that climate fiction is often relegated to the realm of science fiction, a genre that struggles to be taken seriously as literature, particularly in high schools. And yet, as we outline, Alexis Wright herself and other Aboriginal authors have written significant works of literary climate fiction. The identification of what counts as literary in English education is embedded in a history of Euro-Western ideals. Accordingly, it's not surprising that the great works of literature in the secondary canon are still mostly attributed to white male authors, whose universal narratives center white worldviews through the ages and are written in a literary register or genre that is recognizable within this logic of the same system. But climate fictions are increasing in number here in Australia, including significant works by Aboriginal authors. For example, Wright's The Swan Book is an apocalyptic speculative fiction set in Australia in a world overwhelmed by global warming. The novel imagines what the world might be like in 100 years, with mass migrations of millions of climate refugees, all landless and relegated to living on the sea and washing onto Australian shores. It is a story of potential climate politics of the future globally, but is also a reflection on the past and present's ongoing oppression and dispossession of Aboriginal people in Australia. And two other books featured in our Teacher Researchers project are also climate fictions, and those are Terra Nullius by Claire Coleman. That text focused on last groups of people known as natives fleeing into the desert of Central Australia away from settlers who cannot handle extreme climates. Descriptions of the native struggle to survive, the settlers, alongside stories of native children brought into settler mission residential schools for re-education, create a powerful speculative allegory that highlights the past wrongs of colonial invasion through imaginative plot twist. Also, Ellen Van Nerven's short story Water, from their collection Heat and Light, is a more than human ancestral tale about sovereignty, climate, and place. The story centers a species of sand plants who have language and can communicate with humans. The sand plants live on an island that is slated for mining development, and they can dispense fresh water from their limbs. The Aboriginal protagonist of the story develops a deep relationship with a sand plant, and she and her family and friends align with them to form an interspecies and intergenerational resistance against further mining and islandization of their country. We are now in collaboration with Alexis Wright, and will be running an iteration of this project based on her work Carpentaria in 2021. We hope to have lectures as part of that week and include scholars of sustainability and climate fiction. So if there's anybody that's listening right now that's interested, get in touch, because although we're interested in Cli-Fi, we're not experts on climate. And this is part of the problem for English teachers. There's a lot at stake at bringing new texts into schools and learning all these intertextual knowledges you need to do that. And so as a result, they often fall back into teaching what they already know. On that note, we want to acknowledge that as white settlers and researchers and scholars working with predominantly white settler English teachers, we are cautious of mining Wright's work for Indigenous knowledges and epistemologies as if they are objective property to be extracted. We want to acknowledge Wright's work in Carpentaria, in the Swan Book, and other Aboriginal stories, Terra Nullius and water, as integral to the current climate fiction literary turn that we are bringing into the classrooms, but also not have them subsumed within Euro-Western Anthropocene discourse of sudden worry about man-made disasters, which are springing up all over educational research. Given the audience of this talk, I imagine the term the Anthropocene does not need to be defined, but just in case, it has been described as a time where humankind's actions on Earth have made an impact on a geologic scale. The dating of the Anthropocene is contested. Some scholars attribute it to the Industrial Revolution, others to 1492 when Columbus invaded the Americas, others to the detonation of the A-bomb. As each of these varied timestamps suggest, the effects of what has been dubbed the Anthropocene is not felt equally by all people. And climate disasters also are not new. As such, Catherine Yusoff has argued against monumentalizing a discourse around the Anthropocene, in that in many ways it attempts to reclaim a white innocence around geohistory. We are currently working with Aboriginal colleague Sandra Phillips on how reading texts that foreground Indigenous stories around climate might be practiced in schools, which are governed by high-stakes testing and colonial logics. What's clear is we need to tell different stories about climate and country and to tell them differently, but we also need to learn how to read differently. And Larissa is going to talk a little bit about how we've been thinking through these challenges in English before we turn over to Joelle. Larissa?
Thanks, I'm just unmuting. Before being advised. Thank you so much. So just really to round this off now and go back into the classroom. So just want you to think for a moment back into the classroom at the story at the start of our talk, the story in the pandemic with Alexis and the students that I was fortunate enough to be zooming in to just observe and to be part of that. So in terms of where Sarah's left that last point, reading differently, the work that we undertook was, as Sarah said, in a response to stop admiring the problem. We've known collectively and in different contexts, Sarah in a Canadian context, about the challenges of shifting practice in subject English. We've got a lot of data, as you can see, on just really explaining what that problem is, and we can share surveys and we can share a whole range of information with you, but we do need to make a change, and obviously Sarah's been talking about the way we can do that through the teacher researchers. But when we think about the conditions of the classroom and we think about reading differently, we do need to recognise that it's much more than having texts on lists. It's much more than asking Indigenous authors to come in and speak about their work. If we're thinking about sustaining a change, making a sustained change to subject English, then it really is rethinking the pedagogies and the ways of reading that have been tied to Western articulations, imperial notions of subject English. So if we go back to the classroom and we think about those students working with Alexis, they are part of a very high stakes neoliberal subject which asks them to write 2 essays at the end of the year, the sum total of their knowledges of the entire year being brought down to a 2-hour test. We need to think differently about the way in which we're valuing. We need to recognise that if we want to change our thinking about stories and we want to change our discourses and use the possibilities of fiction, then we actually need to look at the bigger system problems that are keeping those in place. So that's a key thing, and I've already mentioned the work of Richard Teese, if you're interested in that, which just shows the way that certain voices have been systematically excluded from subject English because of a high stakes system. And Teese was, looking at, 2013 and earlier, and we can say that this has just become more and more manifest, which makes this moment of a teacher selecting Carpentaria still remarkable. And I think that's what we need to understand, that it remains, it's remarkable within our current context. What we've understood through the Teacher Researchers Project and this notion of reading differently is that 2 things. What we need is for teachers to be able to, as Sarah said, expand their intertextual networks, because what we often find is if teachers take up a particular text, they'll choose it from the list, but they're not necessarily able to connect it with the other texts that they've read. And so what we know is it's much more than a single text, that we've all established Eurocentric Western intertextual networks that need to actually be profoundly unsettled. And so part of the teacher researchers through the use of the archives is to work, as Sarah said, in that way. But what we also understand in our work with Sandra is that this notion of texts and interconnection of texts and reading relationally is a way in which we need to rethink how teachers are prepared to be English teachers and the kind of reading practices they actually bring into the classroom. Just put there on the slide this notion of reader response, which alongside personal growth, Sarah mentioned this earlier, the model of personal growth, the idea that you go into English and you grow personally and you sit a bit outside the text, you're able to read it, you're able to engage in it, and it is all about you, really, and that your reader response is the reader response that's going to happen. This kind of thinking, this thinking of relationally with text, means that we need to look at our reader response in different kinds of ways, and drawing on Sandra's work, this notion of the reader and the teacher coming from particular standpoints, which is not something that we've necessarily been privileging when we've been wanting to engage students with reading in classrooms. We haven't necessarily raised the political context of them as readers in the ways that are going to be helpful going forward to rethinking our reading pedagogies. So this notion of reading relationally, understanding that the reading practices, not just the texts we choose, but the actual practices have themselves inherently got dominant readings of privilege. That's what we're really wanting to unsettle at this point, recognising that we're within a system that is validating and affirming those kinds of reading practices in a high stakes environment. So naming those is part of the challenge, and thinking about then the kind of sustainability we want going forward requires us to be working on the level of system, on the level of student, and on the level of teacher. So we'll just go to our last slide, Sarah. So just a couple of points for us in thinking through these issues. So if we're to change reading practices in Global South contexts, the settler reading experiences of reading a text such as Carpentaria cannot be left to settler pedagogies premised on being conscious isolates, which renders us observers rather than custodians of the world. So we've got this sense of literature and text and story being something we can mine, to use that metaphor, or take in our current models. In this model, we're actually thinking of a responsibility, of reader response having responsibility, than reader response being something in which we simply affirm and confirm the views that we have had. And the last point, relational reading, and this is where we're working through these questions with Sandra Phillips, requires a decentering and unlearning and a new trust of Indigenous narrator and storyteller. These guided acts of reading become active dimensions of remaking the world beyond a crisis. So what we are learning, I guess, in our work is that the challenge of the problem is significant. The possibilities are great. The opportunities are there, but it is working. And I guess it's working in a very interdisciplinary way, as Sarah said, across literary reading, across science, across a whole range of ways to actually change what we think and we believe should be the core business of schooling for young people in a subject like English. That's where we'll leave it.
Thank you so much, Larissa and Sarah. That was just so exciting and generous and generative. I'm going to hand over to you now, Joelle.
Yeah, thanks, Larissa and Sarah. That was really fascinating for me as a climate scientist. So I actually work on the scientific basis of things like climate change. And it was really interesting to get a sense of just how lagged, I guess, the cultural and social response is to these very rapidly developing and urgent scientific issues. And so it was interesting for me because I guess from my perspective, I've been saying for years, climate change isn't just a scientific problem, it's a cultural problem. And I think that now I can see that the rabbit hole goes even deeper. I mean, that table you put up of the text that are read by secondary students, I mean, that made me cringe. I saw Jane Austen, and I also read Chaucer when I was in high school. And that's not stuff that teachers, that students can relate to, particularly at that really formative age. So I think that idea of cultural cringe, so we've got two different things going on there. Some of those texts are, most of them, all of them, I think were pre-1953. I mean, for these very contemporary issues, that's not something that young people can engage with. And I think that's firstly a major issue, the fact that there's this really long, the context that we're talking about, pre-20th century is not really relevant for a lot of these really contemporary topics. And also just that idea of rejecting Australian fiction, I think also that really struck a chord with me as well, because I guess it's really important that we learn to tell our stories as Australians, and clearly the Indigenous voice is really important, but there's also the broader context of the lived experience of what climate change looks like in the nation that is actually the most vulnerable nation in the developed world when it comes to climate change. So sometimes we forget that there's just really basic stories that haven't been told yet in this country, that are aside from the really important Indigenous stories, of course. But I think just our understanding of what climate change looks like in a country like Australia, I think there's a real role for the narrative nonfiction in that space. So I've had a crack at it myself. I mean, I published a book a couple of years ago called Sunburnt Country, The History and Future of Climate Change in Australia. It was published by MUP. And I guess when you were talking about teachers and the fact that they find it hard to engage in technical topics or things that might feel a bit out of their skill set, I've written a book that I hope gives people the foundation for not being afraid of science, because that's the reason why I'm here as well. I mean, I think there have to be more and more people willing to engage across the disciplines and not being so intimidated by science. Okay, so we're not expecting you guys to be scientists. We are scientists, but there are ways of engaging in the material so it doesn't feel so overwhelming. And I think that maybe there's a role there for narrative nonfiction as a stepping stone potentially to getting into fiction, where I think fiction is really important because it sort of releases us from those constraints of I guess the sort of factual world, and allows us to deal with the more speculative elements of this topic, which I think can really engage the imagination. And that's really important, I think, particularly in the context of teaching in secondary schools. So I think it's a really fascinating topic, and it's really terrific to see this sort of initiative in the sense that people are starting to think about how do we start to mainstream these ideas into high school, because I think rethinking education as foundation for how to think as a person moving forward in life. So when I look back and I think about what I learned from Jane Austen, I can't remember what I learned from Jane Austen. I had to write the essay and the 2-hour exam and the rest of it, but that didn't really have a big impact on me. And I think it would be really meaningful if we could find texts that speak to young Australians and Australians more broadly, let's be honest, to really start to inform this sort of cultural shift that we need, because the scientific reality is very dire. And I think we need to have a sense of urgency in how quickly we do this, because as I said, Australia's on the front line of climate change. We've already seen 50% of the Great Barrier Reef die off in a handful of years. We saw over 20% of Australia's forests burn in a single bushfire season. I could keep giving you the list, but sometimes I find that, so I like to refer to it as this sort of conflict we have between the head and the heart. As scientists, we're often really dealing with lots of rational, factual material, and the heart is the space, I think, for the arts, the humanities, for literature. And I came across this quote recently, which I quite like, and it's by Rachel Carson, who was an American ecologist, and she wrote Silent Spring. And you might have heard of Silent Spring. It was a seminal book that was talking about ecological crisis. And she wrote, it's not half so important to know as to feel. And I think that really comes to the heart of what we're talking about with trying to engage people on an emotional level rather than just a factual level. I think that's the challenge for us here as a broader group of people working in this space, because I think science can sometimes be interpreted as just a very cut and dry, boring thing, and it's not. It's actually, it infuses all of life. And I think it's really important just to sort of try and mainstream that so it doesn't become such a politicized issue. And it's so unfortunate that, the laws of physics and chemistry have become so politicized. I mean, to me, that's nonsensical. And it was interesting to hear you guys say that for some teachers, there's a little bit of, you know, apprehension around speaking about a topic that could be considered controversial, or a sense of skepticism or denial. And I think the Murdoch media has a lot to answer to in that space. And that kind of angers me as a climate scientist, because I think it's really muddied the waters. We don't even have good scientific literacy in this country, right? So I think it doesn't help when people start to politicize a topic that really, I feel, has to just become part of our generalized education. And I think that's what you guys are talking about. So for me, it makes me feel hopeful that there are people within the humanities looking to build that bridge. And I think working with the Stella program is a terrific one, because it's really true. Having diverse voices is critically important. And I think we have the ongoing issue of telling the stories of, you know, First Australians. That's an ongoing issue. But I think telling diverse stories, it sounds like we just need to be telling Australian stories. Doesn't matter who's telling them, but just as long as they are Australian. Because I think when we speak about things like climate change, and we're talking about things like the melting of Arctic sea ice or polar bears, people don't relate to that. I think we need to be talking about very real and on the ground lived experience material. And I think James Bradley, you guys probably have read some of his work, Clade, Ghost Species, and Lucy Trelaw's also had her latest book, Salt Creek, I think, was had that type of a climate sort of fiction element to it as well. So I do feel like people are trying in this space, and so it would be good to just sort of be aware of the networks of people working more broadly in this space, because I think it is encouraging, at least from my perspective, because I think unless we get the cultural change that we need, we're not going to be able to move forward quickly enough on this to avert the worst aspects of climate change, which we're already seeing play out right now. So I know what you're talking about here is intergenerational. You're trying to lay a foundation for a cultural change, which I think is going to take time, which I think is brilliant, and it needs to be done. I mean, it's shocking that table you put up showing literature taught in schools. I mean, that speaks volumes. I mean, that's anyway. So I'm still getting over that, but maybe that's all I'll say. I guess from my perspective, thank you from the scientific community for having a go at this. We need more people from the humanities. Really, really, we do. It's not enough to leave it up to the scientists. We have a different skill set, but you know, there are people within our community willing to also share those technical or demystify some of the technical aspects, or because I do think it's important. I've just got to say this one last technical thing. I do think it's important that when you do talk about sort of speculative fiction and things like that, that it has to be plausible. Otherwise, it annoys scientists. So there was a comment there about, we're just like that. It's an affliction. There was a comment there about people moving into the interior of Australia under high levels of warming. Most of inland Australia warms by 5 to 6 degrees by the end of the century. Even if you're adapted, you can't adapt to that. So parts of the country do become uninhabitable under the high levels of warming. And so I think it's really good to collaborate with scientists on that and get a sense of, because that way we can champion the work as well. But if it's something that's so far out there or hasn't been fact checked or just in some way grounded in reality, I think I just think there's potential there is all I'm saying. And I do understand that fiction is by its very nature a bit more explorative and all that kind of thing. But just to keep us on board, it'd be really great if we could ground truth some of the stats in the fiction. But anyway, thanks very much. It's really, really pleasing to see this progress actually. So I commend you on your fine work.
Thank you so much for that, Joelle. There is so much in there, and I really want to allow you to now have a bit of a sideways conversation, but we have one question that I think can actually weave really well into a discussion that you might have, which is from Sangeetha, who sadly missed the beginning of the panel, but asks a really great question around the institutional barriers to getting these changes made to the curriculum and to pedagogical practice, which Sarah and Larissa, you both did address throughout the presentation in part. It's still a really great question to come back to. Sangeetha also asks, and where are the institutional opportunities, particularly thinking about the experience of talking to departments of education on this stuff? how can these changes be embedded among the decision makers who are under all kinds of pressures with multiple objectives? So that's something that I feel like is really touching on both the presentation and Joelle, what you have just said, but I'll let you all have a chat for
Larissa's great on policy in Australia.
Yeah, so thanks, Sangeetha, for the question. One of the ongoing challenges, I think, for making the kinds of changes that we have suggested need to happen for subject English is that teachers are under a lot of pressure to produce certain kinds of outcomes for students that are based on a system that values certain kinds of texts. So where English in the past was perhaps seen as something that was, you know, I sound like I'm looking back in a halcyon way to the 1980s and 90s, but, you know, where there was a lot more criticality that was being able to be brought to bear into the English curriculum. I think, you know, the decades of neoliberalism have in fact meant, and the increasing focus on high stakes literacy assessments and high stakes final assessments for students and scores means that certain texts are valued. So even when new texts are put on the list, it is most likely that a teacher will be more compelled to take a text that they themselves have studied or that there are many resources on that actually make that kind of change. And so we see that in terms of the text lists, it's not that we have bureaucrats who are resisting these kinds of texts, although we do see the kind of text we've been talking about as particularly underrepresented. Indigenous writers, migrant writers, women, a whole group of, you know, basically, you're not going to see them as much as you see other texts by white males. But it's not that there is a decision to not put texts on, but once they're on the list, you've actually got to have them taken up by teachers. And it's these other aspects, that kind of hidden curriculum work that I was talking about, that means that they're not going to be necessarily given the traction on the syllabus. So we see that. We also see things like there's only one Australian text mandated in our curriculum for a student to study in any year of schooling. Now, the fact that we have to mandate an Australian text in this country should indicate to us the magnitude of the problem that we have. No one in England is saying, everybody teach a British text. So the very fact that we have to do this in 2008, our national curriculum said everybody has to teach a text by or about Australia, shows us that we've got this problem. So, you know, we have a kind of institutional issue that is trying to be addressed, but in the trying, we also see the magnitude of that issue. And of course, if you say to a whole group of teachers and systems, well, you're required to teach one Australian text in a year, that also tells you you're only required to teach one Australian text in a year. You're ticking that box. So there are some issues there. In terms of the possibilities, Sarah and I, with our colleagues, particularly Lucy Buzzacott, who's Dr. Lucy Buzzacott, who's a key player in our lab, we've certainly been working with Stella to get in front of education departments. We've been looking at funding for this kind of work. There are many imperatives, and we've certainly had a lot of interest, but it's an area that we will continue to try and progress. I think, as you're saying, Joelle, it needs to be an interdisciplinary piece, because if we're just talking about fiction and we're just talking about this, and we're not making those links for governments around the ways in which this thinking in English, the only compulsory subject in the secondary school, is actually going to change thinking around science and enable students to think more critically about these vital issues, I think that's the piece of work we need to do. So it's not through lack of trying, but, you know, it's making that argument compelling at this time.
Wow, that is all we have time for, and that's probably a really powerful point to end on. I want to thank you all for being here today, for the intellectual generosity that you've offered, for the dialogue that it's not just starting here today, but is making me feel very excited and like something is starting, particularly this offering that Joelle has put out, like novelists talk to scientists. Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Let's talk about that in 2021. Absolutely. So thank you all so much for being with us today. Thank you, audience out there, audience listening at a distant time to this recording. Sarah, Joelle and Larissa, we might just hang on the line for a moment while the audience leave so we can have just a brief decompression from the session. But thank you so much, everybody, for coming today.